Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. They say the brewery was built on old farmland, but I've found things in the basement that suggest otherwise. Stone foundations that predate the building by centuries, and chambers that echo with sounds no machinery should make. My name is Ethan Bouchard, and before you ask, yes, I'm one of those Bouchards whose family helped settle Shelburne back in the 1700s. 3 generations of my relatives worked the quarries in Moncton before the stone ran out. After high school, I bounced around Burlington doing construction work, but the housing boom dried up last winter. When my buddy Jake mentioned Caledonia Brewing Company needed a night maintenance worker, I figured why not. The pay was decent, and I'd always been comfortable working alone. The brewery sits on Route 7, just north of Ferrisburgh in a converted dairy barn that dates back to 1892. During the day, it's bustling with tourists sampling IPAs and taking Instagram photos of the copper kettles. But at night, when the last tour group loads onto their buses and heads back to their Burlington hotels, the place transforms into something else entirely. My first week, everything seemed normal. I'd arrive at 11 p.m., check the fermentation tanks, clean the bottling line, and monitor the cooling systems until 7 a.m. The work wasn't hard, mostly walking circuits through the facility, taking temperature readings, and making sure nothing leaked or overheated. The building creaked like any old structure, and the machinery hummed its mechanical lullabies. Then I found the notebook. It was wedged behind a loose board in the break room, wrapped in oilcloth like someone wanted to preserve it. The handwriting belonged to my predecessor, a guy named Tommy LaFleur, who'd quit without notice 3 weeks before I started. According to the brewery manager, Beth Karen, Tommy had worked nights for 2 years without any problems. Then one morning, she found his keys on the break room table with a note saying he couldn't do it anymore. Inside Tommy's notebook were rules, 7 of them, written in pencil that had been pressed hard enough to leave indentations on the pages beneath. The first time I read them, I laughed. They sounded like something drunk college kids would make up to mess with the new guy. But Tommy's handwriting got shakier as the pages went on, and there were dates, dozens of them, marking nights when he'd encountered things that made him grateful for those rules. I should have walked away then. Should have driven back to Burlington and taken that job at the lumber yard my cousin offered me. Instead, I folded the notebook and slipped it into my work jacket. Call it curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper. That stubborn Bouchard pride that kept my ancestors digging stone long after the easy quarries played out. Now, 3 months later, I understand why Tommy left those keys behind. Some nights, I catch myself counting the hours until dawn, checking my watch every few minutes like it might somehow make the sun rise faster. But I'm still here, still following those 7 rules. Because the alternative is worse than anything you can imagine. Yeah, if you're thinking about taking the night shift at Caledonia Brewing, read this first. Every word of it is true. My first night following Tommy's rules started ordinary enough. I've been working at Caledonia for 2 weeks, getting familiar with the routine. Check the fermentation tanks, monitor the glycol cooling system, sanitize the bottling equipment. The kind of work that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy. The notebook sat heavy in my jacket pocket as I made my initial rounds. Tommy's 7 rules stared at me from memory. Rule 1. Never enter the basement alone between midnight and 3 a.m. Rule 2. If you hear someone calling your name from the grain storage area, ignore it completely. Rule 3. The walk-in cooler door locks from the inside only. If you find it open, close it immediately and don't look inside. Rule 4. During tank cleaning, count the copper kettles. There should be 4. If you count 5, leave the building. Rule 5. The old stone foundation has a door marked 1847. It stays locked. Always. Rule 6. If the lights in the tasting room flicker 3 times, go to the employee bathroom and wait 10 minutes before continuing your rounds. Rule 7. Never acknowledge the woman in the white dress, no matter where you see her. At 11:47 p.m., I was calibrating the thermometers on the fermentation tanks when I heard it, my name echoing from somewhere near the grain silos. Ethan, you there? The voice sounded like my supervisor, Dale Prue, but Dale had left at 6 p.m. with the rest of the day crew. I pulled out my phone and called him. It went straight to voicemail, and in the background recording, I could hear his television playing some late-night talk show. The voice called again, closer this time. Ethan, need you to check something in the grain room. Rule 2 said ignore it completely. So I kept working, adjusting valves and recording temperatures, even as the voice grew more insistent. It started to sound frustrated, then angry, like Dale when the bottling line jammed during busy season. Ethan, get over here now. My hands shook slightly as I wrote down the tank readings. The voice knew exactly how Dale spoke, that sharp edge he got when deadlines approached. But Dale was home in Essex Junction, probably asleep in his recliner. By 12:30 a.m., the calling stopped. I finished the tank checks and moved to the bottling area, where thousands of brown bottles waited in neat rows for tomorrow's run. The conveyor belts sat silent, but something about their stillness felt wrong, like they'd just stopped moving instead of being shut down hours ago. That's when I noticed the walk-in cooler. The heavy steel door stood ajar, cold mist drifting out into the main production floor. I checked it during my first round at 11:15 p.m., and it had been sealed tight. Now, pale vapor curled around the doorframe like reaching fingers. According to Rule 3, I needed to close it immediately without looking inside. But as I approached, something made me pause. The mist wasn't the usual white fog you'd expect from a refrigeration unit. This vapor had a yellowish tinge, and it carried a smell I couldn't identify. Sweet and cloying, like fruit left too long in summer heat. I grabbed the door handle and started to pull it shut, but a sound from inside made me freeze. Breathing. Slow, measured breaths that didn't match the rhythm of the cooling compressor. Don't look inside. The rule was clear, but curiosity killed more than cats in my family. My great-grandfather died in a quarry accident because he had to see what was behind a rock fall that other miners avoided. I tilted my head just enough to peer through the gap. The cooler stretched back further than it should have. What I remembered as a 12-foot storage room now seemed to extend into darkness, beyond where the back wall should be. Hanging sides of beef swayed gently despite the still air, and between them, something pale moved. A woman in a white dress stood at the far end, facing away from me. Her dark hair hung straight down her back, and she swayed slightly from side to side, as if listening to music I couldn't hear. She looked small, almost childlike in the oversized dress. Then she started to turn around. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy steel sealed with a satisfying click, and the yellow mist began to dissipate. Rule 7. Never acknowledge the woman in the white dress. I'd almost broken 2 rules in one night. For the rest of my shift, I stuck to the main production floor, avoiding the grain storage area and giving the walk-in cooler a wide berth. Every few minutes, I'd check Tommy's notebook, reading his penciled notes in the margins. Next to Rule 3, he'd written, "She's always hungry. Door won't hold her if she knows you've seen her." Next to Rule 7, don't let her know you exist. She's been waiting a long time for someone to notice her. At 6:45 a.m., Dale arrived for the morning shift change. He looked exactly like he had when he'd left the night before. Flannel shirt, work boots, coffee-stained Carhartt jacket. Nothing unusual about his voice or mannerisms. "How'd the night go?" he asked, checking the logbook where I'd recorded temp temperatures and cleaning schedules. "Quiet," I said. "Everything ran smooth." He nodded and headed toward the grain storage area to prep for the morning delivery from the Champlain Valley farms. I almost called out to warn him, but the rules didn't mention anything about daytime. Maybe whatever lived in this place only stirred when the sun went down. I drove home to my apartment in Winooski as the morning light painted Lake Champlain silver. But even with my blackout curtains drawn and my white noise machine running, I couldn't shake the image of that woman turning around in the cooler. Some nights, you learn that curiosity has a price. Other nights, you learn that following the rules might be the only thing standing between you and something far worse than unemployment. 3 nights later, I learned why Tommy had pressed his pencil so hard when writing Rule 4. The evening started differently. Beth Karen, the brewery manager, stayed late to finish inventory reports, which meant I had company until nearly midnight. She was one of those transplants from Massachusetts who moved to Vermont for the authentic rural experience, but still complained about the lack of decent sushi restaurants. "You settling in okay, Ethan?" she asked, pecking at her laptop in the office overlooking the production floor. "Dale says you're picking things up quick." "Yeah, it's good work," I said, cleaning the copper fittings on the main brewing line. "Reminds me of helping my dad with the furnace maintenance back home." Beth smiled that polite smile city people give when you mention manual labor. "Well, Tommy left some pretty detailed notes about the night procedures. Did you find his logbook?" My hand instinctively moved toward my jacket pocket where the notebook rested. "Just basic maintenance stuff. Nothing too complicated." She nodded and returned to her spreadsheets. He was thorough, I'll give him that. Sometimes maybe too thorough. Always writing things down, muttering about procedures that weren't in any manual I'd seen. After she left at 11:52 p.m., I began my usual rounds. The building felt different without her presence. Larger somehow, as if the walls had exhaled and expanded in the darkness. I checked the fermentation tanks, noting the steady bubbling that meant the yeast was doing its work, converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The first sign of trouble came at 12:23 a.m. I was in the main brewing room, counting the copper kettles as part of my nightly routine. 1, 2, 3, 4. The usual quartet that had been installed when they converted the old dairy barn. But as I turned to mark down the count in my logbook, something caught my peripheral vision. A 5th kettle stood in the corner where none had been before. This wasn't some trick of shadows or tired eyes. The kettle was solid, real, with the same copper patina as the others. Steam rose from its surface, suggesting it was actively heating, though no pipes connected it to the gas lines or electrical systems. Rule 4 was clear. If you count 5 kettles, leave the building. But this was my job, my paycheck. And the rational part of my brain, the part inherited from generations of practical Bouchards who fixed what was broken and explained what seemed strange, demanded I investigate first. I approached the 5th kettle slowly. Unlike the others, this one bore no manufacturer's plate or serial number. Instead, carved symbols covered its surface. Not the decorative scrollwork you'd find on antique equipment, but angular marks that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift when I wasn't focusing on them, rearranging themselves into new configurations. The lid was slightly ajar, allowing steam to escape. Through the gap, I glimpsed liquid that wasn't water or wort. It was thick, dark red, and moved with a viscosity that reminded me of blood. A sound came from inside the kettle, a wet, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against metal from within. I backed away, my rational mind finally surrendering to the evidence. This wasn't equipment malfunction or tricks of perception. Something existed in this brewery that operated by different rules than the ones I'd grown up understanding. As I reached for my keys to leave, the tapping from the fifth kettle changed rhythm. 3 quick beats, then silence. It repeated the pattern, growing louder each time. Then I heard tapping from the second kettle. Same rhythm like an echo. Then the third, the fourth. All 4 original kettles had joined the chorus, their surfaces vibrating with each impact. The sound filled the brewing room, a percussion section playing a song I didn't recognize but somehow felt in my bones. An ancient rhythm that predated any music I'd ever heard. I ran. The tapping followed me through the production floor, echoing off the concrete walls and steel equipment. As I fumbled with the door locks, I glanced back once and saw steam pouring from all 5 kettles now, filling the brewing room with a fog that glowed faintly yellow in the security lighting. Outside, my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but wouldn't catch, as if something essential was missing from the combustion process. I sat in the cab, watching the brewery through the windshield, seeing shapes moving behind the windows that were too tall to be human. At 3:17 a.m., the engine finally caught. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was behind the locked door of my apartment. The next morning, Dale called. "You feeling all right? Your truck was here all night, but the building was locked up tight when I came in." "Had some engine trouble," I said. "Got it running again around dawn." "Well, everything looks normal here. All 4 kettles are clean and ready for today's batch. 4 kettles, not 5. That afternoon, I stopped by the Shelburne Museum to research the history of the land where Caledonia Brewing sat. The local history section had records dating back to the 1700s, including property deeds and survey maps. The brewery's location had indeed been farmland, but not the kind of farming most people would recognize. According to a 1847 newspaper clipping from the Burlington Free Press, the Thibodeau family had operated what they called a rendering facility on that site. They processed livestock that had died from disease or injury, boiling down carcasses to extract tallow and bone meal. The operation shut down abruptly in 1848 after several workers disappeared. The newspaper article mentioned strange practices and ungodly rituals, but gave no specifics. The Thibodeaus abandoned the property, leaving behind stone foundations and specialized equipment. One detail jumped out at me. The rendering operation had used 5 large copper vats for boiling down organic matter. That evening, I almost called in sick, but rent was due, and I'd already used up my savings during the months of unemployment. So I drove back to Caledonia Brewing, Tommy's notebook heavy in my pocket like a talisman. The building looked normal in the early evening light, just another renovated barn housing another Vermont micro-business. Tourists were finishing the last brewery tour of the day, sampling IPAs and taking photos of the copper kettles. 4 copper kettles, always 4. But I knew now that numbers could lie, just like everything else in that place. The question wasn't whether there were really 5 kettles. It was what happened to people who stayed around to count them twice. As I clocked in for my shift, I noticed something new in Tommy's notebook. A page I'd missed before, tucked between rules 4 and 5. Written in different ink, with handwriting that wasn't quite Tommy's. Some things are hungry for more than food. Some things have been waiting since 1847 for someone to feed them properly. The woman in white remembers the rendering days. She remembers what the Thibodeaus discovered in those copper vats, and she's been practicing patience ever since. Below that, in Tommy's familiar scrawl, "Found this page today. I didn't write it. Getting out tonight. Don't let her know you can read. The basement door had been calling to me for weeks. Rule 5 was explicit. The old stone foundation has a door marked 1847. It stays locked. Always. But knowing something is forbidden only makes it more tempting, especially when you work alone in a building that seems to breathe differently after midnight. Tonight felt different from the start. The October air carried the smell of wood smoke from Shelburne Farms, mixed with something else, something sweet and rotten that reminded me of the rendering facility research I'd done. As I unlocked the brewery's main entrance, my keychain felt heavier than usual, weighed down by keys I'd never been given explanations for. Beth had mentioned during hiring that I'd have access to all necessary areas, but several keys on the ring didn't match any locks I've encountered in my month of night shifts. One was particularly old, made of black iron with teeth worn smooth by decades of use. It felt warm to the touch, even on cold nights. My first 3 hours passed normally. I checked fermentation tanks, monitored cooling systems, and sanitized equipment. The brewery hummed with its usual mechanical lullabies, pumps circulating glycol, compressors maintaining temperature, the soft bubbling of active yeast cultures. But underneath these familiar sounds, I started noticing something else. Footsteps. Not the sharp click of dress shoes or the heavy thud of work boots. These were soft, shuffling steps that seemed to come from below the main floor. They'd start near the grain storage area, move toward the brewing room, then fade somewhere around the employee break room. At 2:17 a.m., I decided to investigate. The basement access was tucked behind the main staircase, marked with a simple storage sign that looked newer than the rest of the building's fixtures. I'd been down there once during my first week, just a quick look to familiarize myself with the layout. It was mostly empty space with concrete floors and exposed stone walls, used for storing cleaning supplies and spare parts. But tonight, as I descended the wooden steps, I noticed details I'd missed before. The stone walls weren't random fieldstone like most Vermont basements. These were cut blocks, fitted together with the precision of professional masons. Symbols were carved into some blocks, the same angular marks I'd seen on the 5th copper kettle. They seemed to glow faintly in my flashlight beam, though that might have been tricks of tired eyes and moving shadows. At the bottom of the stairs, I found 3 doors. The first led to the storage room I remembered, metal shelving units holding bottles of sanitizing solution and boxes of replacement gaskets. The second was newer, marked electrical in fresh white paint. The third door was different. Carved from dark wood that had weathered to the color of old bone, it bore brass numbers that read 1847. This was the door from Rule 5, the one that was supposed to stay locked always. But as I approached, I realized the lock mechanism was unlike anything I'd seen in Vermont's old buildings. Instead of a typical deadbolt or key lock, this door secured with an intricate system of metal pins and rotating discs. The mechanism looked almost organic, like the skeleton of some complex sea creature. And despite Rule 5's insistence that it stay locked, every instinct told me this door wanted to be opened. The warm iron key on my keychain seemed to pulse against my palm. I should have walked away. Should have gone back upstairs and finished my shift without testing boundaries I didn't understand. But the Bouchard curiosity that had killed my great-grandfather in the quarries wouldn't let me leave without at least trying the key. It fit perfectly. The lock mechanism responded with a series of soft clicks, each pin and disc falling into alignment like pieces of a puzzle, solving themselves. When the final tumbler dropped into place, the door swung open on hinges that moved silently, despite their obvious age. Beyond the threshold lay a chamber that couldn't exist. The room stretched back much further than the building's foundation should have allowed. Stone walls rose to a vaulted ceiling, lost in shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. The The floor was paved with the same precision-cut blocks as the walls, arranged in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. But it wasn't empty. Along the walls stood copper vessels, not the refined brewing kettles upstairs, but crude, bulbous containers that looked like they'd been hammered into shape by someone who understood function better than form. 5 of them, each large enough to hold a person. Dark stains covered their surfaces, and the air around them carried that sweet, rotten smell I detected outside. The woman in white stood beside the central vessel. She faced away from me, her dark hair hanging straight down her back, like she was a child playing dress-up in an adult's clothes. But there was nothing childlike about the way she stood, perfectly still, perfectly balanced, like she'd been waiting in that exact spot for decades. Rule 7 said never acknowledge her, no matter where I saw her. But she was already here, already part of this space that existed outside the normal rules of architecture and physics. Maybe the rule didn't apply in her domain. "You opened the door," she said without turning around. Her voice carried the accent of old Vermont families, the French-Canadian inflection my grandmother had possessed before she learned to hide it. Tommy never had the courage. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the stone floor. "Who are you?" "Marguerite Thibodeau." She still didn't turn around. I helped my father with the rendering until the workers started disappearing. Then I helped him in other ways. The name connected with my research. The Thibodeaus had owned the rendering facility, but newspaper accounts had mentioned the family disappearing along with their workers in 1848. "You've been dead for over a century," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Death is just another kind of rendering." She moved closer to the central copper vessel, her white dress rustling like autumn leaves. "Breaking down what people think they are, extracting what's useful, discarding the rest." I noticed movement in the shadows beyond the vessels. Other shapes, less defined than Marguerite, but no less present. The missing workers, perhaps, or the other night shift employees who'd encountered this room over the years. "Tommy left warnings about you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Tommy was smart. He understood that some hungers can't be satisfied with grain and hops. She finally began to turn around. "But you're different. You opened the door. You came down here willingly." I caught a glimpse of her face before I forced myself to look away. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, eyes that reflected light like standing water, a mouth that smiled with too many teeth. She wasn't wearing someone else's face, but she wasn't entirely human either. "The rendering never stopped," she continued. "We just became more selective about our ingredients. The brewery provides perfect cover. All those fermentation processes, all that organic matter transforming from one state to another. No one questions strange smells or unusual sounds." The copper vessels began to emit a low humming sound, like the fermentation tanks upstairs but deeper, more resonant. The liquid inside them wasn't wort or beer. It was something that had once been human, broken down to its essential components and left to age in darkness. "Rule 5 exists for a reason," I said, backing toward the door. "Rules exist to create order from chaos, but some chaos is older than any rules." Marguerite moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. My father understood that. He learned there are things that live in the spaces between what people consider possible. The shadows around the other vessels grew darker, more defined. I could see faces now, Tommy's predecessor, and others stretching back decades. Night shift workers who'd made the same choice I was facing now. "The skinwalkers taught us about patience," Marguerite said, "about wearing faces that don't belong to us, about walking in shapes that nature never intended. They came down from the Adirondacks sometimes, trading knowledge for meat. That's when my father realized the rendering could be more than just business. The temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, and frost formed on the copper vessels, despite the warmth they had been generating moments before. "You can leave," she said, though her smile suggested leaving wasn't really an option. "Walk back upstairs, finish your shift, drive home to your apartment in Winooski. Pretend you never opened this door. What's the alternative? Stay. Learn what Tommy was too afraid to discover. Understand why some rules exist to protect the wrong people." I heard footsteps on the wooden stairs above, slow, measured steps that matched the rhythm I'd been hearing all night. Dale's voice echoed down from the main floor. "Ethan? You down there? Thought I saw your truck outside." But Dale didn't work nights, and his voice carried that same frustrated edge I'd heard calling from the grain storage area weeks ago. "Make your choice quickly," Marguerite said. "Some opportunities only come once." The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Through the open door, I saw a figure that looked like Dale but moved wrong, joints bending at angles that anatomy shouldn't allow, head tilted too far to one side, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Not Dale. Something wearing Dale's appearance, just like the skinwalkers Marguerite had mentioned. I ran toward the door, slamming it shut behind me as I reached the stairs. The lock mechanism engaged automatically, pins and discs clicking back into their secured positions. Behind the wood, I heard Marguerite laughing, a sound like breaking glass wrapped in silk. The Dale thing stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking my path to the main floor. Up close, the impersonation was even worse. His skin had a waxy quality, like a candle left too close to heat. His smile stretched wider than human mouths should accommodate. "Ethan," it said in Dale's voice. "Been looking for you. Time to start your real training." The Dale thing moved like a marionette with tangled strings. I pressed myself against the basement door, the warm metal of the 1847 lock burning through my shirt. The creature wearing my supervisor's face tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped human vertebrae, studying me with eyes that held no recognition of our shared work history or casual friendship. "You've been busy tonight," it said, Dale's familiar Vermont drawl corrupted by something that had learned human speech from listening rather than living. "Marguerite says you're ready for advancement." The stairs creaked under its weight as it took a step closer. Up close, the impersonation showed its flaws. Dale's flannel shirt hung wrong on this thing's frame, as if the body underneath wasn't quite the right proportions. His work boots were laced too tight, cutting into flesh that bulged around the edges like rising dough. "Where's the real Dale?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "Dale Prue is safe at home in Essex Junction, sleeping in his recliner with the television playing old westerns." The thing smiled with Dale's mouth but too many teeth. "We don't need to harm the living when their faces work so well for our purposes." It moved closer, and I caught a scent that no amount of aftershave could mask. The sweet, rotten smell of the rendering facility mixed with something wilder, like an animal that had been dead too long in the woods. "The skinwalkers taught us about borrowing appearances," it continued, "about walking in skins that don't belong to us. But they never understood the potential for longer-term arrangements." I tried to edge around it toward the stairs, but the thing moved to block my path. Its movements were getting smoother, more human-like, as if wearing Dale's form was teaching it how to inhabit a body properly. "Marguerite has plans for you, Ethan Bouchard. Your family has deep roots in this land. The old quarry families understand stone and earth in ways that newcomers never will. My family quarried limestone, not whatever this is. Your great-grandfather, Laurent Bouchard, didn't die in an accident. The Dale Thing's smile widened. He found something in the deepest quarry shaft. Chambers that were carved, not blasted. Symbols that matched the ones downstairs. He was smart enough to seal the entrance before it could spread, but not smart enough to leave it alone entirely. My chest felt tight. Laurent Bouchard's death was family legend. A cave-in at the Moncton quarry that trapped him with 3 other workers. The rescue teams never found the bodies, just empty spaces where men should have been. You're lying. Your grandfather, Raymond, kept Laurent's journal. Read it sometime. He documented 3 weeks of strange encounters before the cave-in. Things that looked like his co-workers but moved wrong. Voices calling from sealed shafts. Symbols that appeared on quarry walls overnight. The creature reached into Dale's jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Raymond passed the journal to your father. Your father hid it in the same place Laurent hid his findings, in the basement of the old Bouchard farmhouse on Spear Street. I knew the house. It had been abandoned for 20 years, ever since my father moved to Burlington. But we'd never sold it, never knocked it down. Just let the forest reclaim it slowly, like the land was taking back what had always belonged to it. This is all connected, I said, understanding dawning like cold water in my stomach. The quarries, the rendering facility, the brewery, they're all built on the same network of caves and chambers. The Abenaki knew about these places long before European settlers arrived. They had their own rules for what lived underground. The Dale Thing handed me the paper. It was a photocopy of a hand-drawn map, showing tunnels that connected sites across western Vermont. The brewery sat at a central node, with lines extending to the old quarries, the abandoned Bouchard farmhouse, and a dozen other locations I didn't recognize. Your family has been protecting one of the entrance points for 4 generations without realizing it. But protection requires understanding, and understanding requires cooperation. What do you want from me? Same thing we wanted from Tommy LaFleur, from the night shift workers before him. Someone to maintain the balance, to follow the rules that keep both sides safe. The temperature in the basement dropped again. My breath misted as I spoke. Both sides. The ones who stay in the dark spaces, and the ones who live in the light. We've coexisted for centuries, but coexistence requires maintenance, rules, boundaries. Above us, I heard the main door of the brewery open and close. Footsteps crossed the production floor. The real Dale's familiar gait, heavy and purposeful. He called out, "Ethan, your truck's here, but the logbook shows you missed the 2 a.m. temperature check." The Dale Thing beside me flickered like a candle flame in wind. For a moment, its stolen features wavered, revealing something underneath that wasn't entirely animal or human. Then it solidified again, though the resemblance was less perfect now. "Time's running short," it said. "Make your choice." "What choice?" "Accept the true nature of your job here. Learn to manage the boundaries between what people think is real and what actually exists, or walk away and let someone less qualified take responsibility for keeping things stable." The real Dale's footsteps approached the basement stairs. I could hear him checking doors, probably wondering why the storage area was unlocked when protocol required it to stay secured during night shifts. If I walk away, what happens to the next person who takes this job? The same thing that would have happened to you if you'd ignored the rules. The same thing that happened to the rendering workers in 1847. Some hungers don't understand the difference between willing and unwilling participants. I thought about Tommy's notebook, about the shaky handwriting that got worse with each entry, about my predecessor who'd lasted 2 years before leaving his keys on the break room table, about Laurent Bouchard and the sealed quarry chamber that might have held answers I wasn't ready to understand. The Dale thing moved closer to the electrical room door. There's a tunnel behind the circuit breaker panel. It connects to the main chamber network. If you choose to learn more, start there tomorrow night. If you choose to walk away, we'll find someone else. M. Dale? The real Dale? Will continue living his life, never knowing that something borrowed his face for a conversation in a basement that officially doesn't exist. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. Real Dale's voice called down. "Everything okay down there?" "Just checking the water heater." I called back, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Be right up." When I turned back toward the Dale thing, it was gone. The basement held only me, the locked 1847 door, and the lingering scent of something wild that didn't belong in human spaces. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs shaking with each step. Real Dale waited at the top, looking exactly like he always did. Tired eyes, coffee-stained jacket, the slight stoop that came from 20 years of brewery work. "Water heater giving you trouble?" he asked. "Just a noise. Probably the expansion tank settling." He nodded and checked his watch. "Well, morning shift starts in 3 hours. Why don't you finish up early tonight? I can handle the last temperature check." I wanted to tell him about the thing that had worn his face, about the tunnels and the rendering chamber and the choice I'd been given. Instead, I handed him the logbook and headed for the door. "See you tomorrow night?" I said. "You bet. And Ethan, you're doing good work here. Better than some of the guys we've had on nights." Outside, the October air felt clean and cold after the stale atmosphere of the basement. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes, engine running, heater blasting, trying to decide if I should drive straight to the Burlington Police Department or pack my belongings and leave Vermont entirely. In the end, I drove home to Winooski and sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at the photocopy of Laurent Bouchard's map and wondering what my great-grandfather had really found in those quarry depths. Some choices can't be unmade once you understand their true weight. I spent the next day researching my family's history at the Vermont Historical Society in Montpelier. The librarian, an elderly woman named Sylvie Gagnon, who remembered my grandmother from church, helped me navigate their collection of local records and family documents. "The Bouchards were always diggers," she said, pulling out a box marked Quarry Records 1889 to 1935. "Your great-grandfather Laurent had a reputation for finding stone where others found only soil." The box contained dozens of photographs from the Moncton quarries, showing crews of French-Canadian workers extracting limestone blocks from increasingly deep excavations. Laurent appeared in several photos, a compact man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands. In the later pictures, taken closer to his death, he looked haunted. But it was the personal documents that made my stomach clench. Laurent's journal wasn't just a work record. Starting 3 weeks before his death, the entries changed from routine notes about stone quality and work crew assignments to something else entirely. The handwriting became more urgent, pressed harder into the paper, like Tommy's notebook had been. September 15th, 1923. Found symbols carved in the south wall of Shaft 7. Not Abenaki markings. These are older. Pierre Lemieux refuses to work that section anymore. Says the symbols move when he's not looking directly at them. September 18th, 1923. Joseph Dubois didn't come to work today. His wife says he left for the quarry before dawn but never arrived. Found his lunch pail at the entrance to Shaft 7, but no sign of Joseph. The symbols are spreading to other walls. September 22nd, 1923. Something is calling from the deepest part of Shaft 7. Sounds like Joseph, but Joseph's voice shouldn't echo from places we've never excavated. The other men hear it too. but they won't speak about it directly. September 28th, 1923. The calling has spread to multiple shafts. Yesterday I heard my own father's voice, though he died 10 years ago. The symbols cover entire walls now. They form patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes, like looking at broken glass in sunlight. October 3rd, 1923. Found a chamber behind the newest symbols. Not carved by our tools. This space was here before we ever broke ground. The walls are covered with the same symbols, but older, worn smooth by centuries of something. There are copper vessels inside, similar to the ones the rendering operation used. October 7th, 1923. Joseph emerged from Shaft 7 today. But it's not Joseph. It moves like him, speaks like him, knows things about his family and work. But his eyes reflect light wrong, and he smells like the rendering facility that closed 15 years ago. The real Joseph is still down there, in the chamber. What came back is something else wearing his face. October 10th, 1923. More of them each day. Pierre came back, but not Pierre. Marcel came back, but not Marcel. They work alongside the living men, and most can't tell the difference. But I can see how they move. Too fluid, like their bones have been softened and reformed. October 12th, 1923. I've sealed the entrance to the chamber with dynamite and limestone blocks. The symbols are still spreading, but slower now. The false workers have dispersed, probably to find other places to emerge. I've documented everything in this journal and hidden copies in 3 locations. If something happens to me, someone needs to understand what we found. October 14th, 1923. They know I sealed their entrance. The false workers have been asking about me, visiting my house, speaking to my family. But they're not angry. They're patient. They understand that sealing one entrance doesn't eliminate the network. They're waiting for someone to open a new one. The final entry was dated October 15th, 1923, the day of the cave-in that killed Laurent and 3 other workers. The chamber system extends beyond Moncton. I've found references to similar discoveries at rendering facilities, old farmsteads, anywhere human activity intersects with the limestone cave networks. They've been waiting underneath Vermont for centuries, learning from each generation of people who find them. My grandson Raymond will inherit this knowledge whether he wants it or not. The Bouchards have always been biggers. Some excavations are deeper than others. Sylvie watched me read, her expression growing more concerned with each page I turned. "Your great-grandfather was a thoughtful man," she said carefully. Some people said the quarry work affected his mind toward the end, but I remember him as someone who saw patterns where others saw only coincidence. "Did you know about the rendering facility connection?" Her weathered hands smoothed the papers in the box. "The Thibodeau operation?" "Yes, there were always stories. My mother's generation spoke of workers who came back different, families who disappeared overnight. But those were different times. People moved around more. Communication was harder. Easy for stories to grow beyond facts. But you believe Laurent found something?" Sylvie considered this carefully. "I believe your great-grandfather encountered something that changed his understanding of what lies beneath Vermont. Whether that something was supernatural or simply psychological, I can't say. But the Bouchard family has carried a burden for 4 generations. Maybe it's time someone decided what to do with it." That evening, I drove to the old Bouchard farmhouse on Spear Street. The building had been slowly surrendering to the forest for 20 years, shingles green with moss, foundation stones shifting as roots worked between them. But the basement entrance was still accessible through rusted cellar doors that opened with the same iron key from my brewery keychain. The basement revealed Laurent's true legacy. Behind a false wall of stacked fieldstone, I found his private workshop. The space contained maps, photographs, and specimens that documented decades of research into Vermont's underground network. Jars filled with mineral samples sat alongside crude sketches of symbols and detailed drawings of tunnel systems that connected locations across 3 counties. But the centerpiece was Laurent's expanded map. This version was much larger than the photocopy the Dale thing had shown me, hand-drawn on surveyor's paper and updated over years of investigation. Red lines connected the brewery to dozens of other sites, abandoned quarries, old farms, caves that appeared on no modern geological surveys. Each location was marked with dates and brief notes about discoveries made there. The brewery wasn't just part of the network, it was a central hub with more connections than any other site. A leather journal sat beside the map, filled with Laurent's careful documentation of each location. The Thibodeau rendering facility appeared repeatedly, identified as the most active site until its closure in 1848. After that, activity had shifted to other locations, following patterns Laurent had spent decades learning to predict. The entities require specific conditions, he'd written: limestone caves for stability, human activity for cover, and organic matter for sustenance. They don't create new sites. They wait for us to dig into spaces they've occupied for centuries. The skinwalkers are not the source. They're students. The original entities taught them about wearing faces and walking in borrowed forms. But the skinwalkers eventually moved north into the Adirondacks, while the teachers remained underground, refining their techniques over generations. Each site requires a caretaker who understands the rules, someone who can maintain the boundary between their world and ours. Without proper management, the entities will expand their territory until the balance shifts permanently. I found my father's name in the journal's final entries, written in different ink. He'd continued Laurent's work for several years before deciding the knowledge was too dangerous to pursue. Instead of passing it to me directly, he'd hidden everything and hoped the responsibility would end with his generation. But responsibility doesn't disappear through avoidance. As I read, I began to understand what the Dale thing had meant about choice. The entities weren't malevolent in any human sense. They were ancient, patient, and utterly alien in their logic. They'd coexisted with humans for centuries by finding people willing to maintain the necessary boundaries. Without that cooperation, they would simply take what they needed to survive. The rendering facility had collapsed when the Thibodeaus lost control of their role as caretakers. The quarry had been sealed when Laurent chose destruction over management. But the brewery represented a new opportunity for balance, if someone was willing to accept the responsibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Dale. "Everything okay? You seemed shaken up last night." I looked around Laurent's hidden workshop, at 4 generations of Bouchard men who'd encountered this same choice and tried to find ways around it. Laurent had sealed caves and died for his efforts. My grandfather had hidden the knowledge. My father had moved away from the family land and pretended the problem didn't exist. None of their solutions had worked permanently. I drove back to Caledonia Brewing 3 hours before my shift started, using my key to enter the building while it was still locked for the night. The production floor felt different when I wasn't alone. Warmer, more human, less like a stage set for supernatural encounters. But I wasn't here for the familiar spaces. The electrical room was smaller than I'd expected, cramped with circuit breakers and conduit runs that served the brewery's modern equipment. But behind the main panel, just as the Dale thing had promised, I found a gap in the concrete foundation. The opening was barely wide enough for a person, hidden behind equipment that hadn't been moved in years. My flashlight revealed a tunnel carved through bedrock, supported by the same precision stonework I'd seen in the basement chamber. This wasn't recent construction. It was part of the original network, probably connecting to caves that had existed long before human settlement. The tunnel sloped downward, following natural fractures in the limestone. After 50 feet, it opened into a circular chamber, with passages leading in 6 directions. Each passage was marked with symbols that matched Laurent's drawings, and each led to different parts of the network. One passage was wider than the others, with fresher air currents suggesting it connected to an active entrance. As I approached, I heard familiar voices echoing from the darkness, the same fake calling that had lured me toward the grain storage area weeks ago. But now I understood what the voices represented. They weren't threats or traps. They were invitations. The entities were offering partnership, not predation. They needed someone who understood the rules to help maintain the balance they'd preserved for centuries. Standing in that chamber, surrounded by passages that connected to sites across Vermont, I realized Laurent had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't a burden to be avoided or sealed away. It was a responsibility that required acceptance and understanding. The voices grew louder, more welcoming. In the echoes, I heard not just the fake Dale, but other caretakers from other sites. People who'd made the same choice I was facing, who'd learned to work with entities that existed beyond human understanding of reality. My great-grandfather had tried to fight them. My grandfather had tried to hide from them. My father had tried to ignore them. Maybe it was time for a Bouchard to try cooperation instead. The first lesson came at 1:33 a.m. on a Thursday night, when the November wind rattled the brewery's windows like skeletal fingers against glass. I'd been following the tunnels for a week, mapping connections and learning the rhythm of the underground network. Each passage told a story about Vermont's hidden history. Chambers carved by people who'd understood that some knowledge required secrecy. Spaces where the boundary between worlds grew thin enough to step across. Tonight, Marguerite was waiting in the main chamber. She stood beside the central copper vessel, her white dress luminous in the darkness. But this time, she faced me directly, and I could see her features clearly. She looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 25, with the sharp cheekbones and dark eyes common to French-Canadian families. Beautiful, if you could ignore the fact that she'd been dead for over a century. "You've been exploring," she said, "learning the layout. That's wise. The network requires understanding before cooperation." Tommy's rules didn't mention cooperation. Tommy's rules were designed to maintain distance, but distance only works when both sides want separation. We've grown tired of separation. The other copper vessels began to emit their low humming sound, harmonizing in frequencies that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The liquid inside them glowed faintly, casting shifting patterns on the stone walls. "What do you want from me that's different from what you wanted from Tommy?" Marguerite moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. "Tommy was a caretaker. You could be a partner. There's a difference between maintaining boundaries and managing transformation." Transformation into what? Something more efficient than the current arrangement. The rendering facility served our needs for 50 years, but it was crude, obvious. The quarries worked for several decades, but excavation eventually attracts too much attention. This brewery has potential for permanence. She gestured toward the vessels, and their humming intensified. These contain what remains of volunteers from previous arrangements, workers who chose integration over separation. Their knowledge, their memories, their understanding, preserved and refined over generations. That's not preservation, that's murder. Is it murder when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly? The original form is gone, but something new emerges. Something that retains the essential elements while gaining capabilities the original never possessed. The temperature in the chamber dropped, and my breath began to mist. But the cold felt different now, not threatening, but clarifying, like stepping outside on a crisp winter morning. The skinwalkers taught us about adaptation, Marguerite continued, but they focused on temporary borrowing, wearing faces for brief periods, walking in stolen forms until they tired of the deception. We learned something more sophisticated. She approached one of the smaller vessels and placed her hand on its surface. The metal began to glow where she touched it, and the humming changed pitch. Permanent integration, taking the useful aspects of human experience while discarding the limitations. Fear, aging, the need for sleep, the weakness of flesh, all eliminated while preserving memory, personality, the capacity for growth. You're talking about stealing people's souls. I'm talking about evolution. Your great-grandfather understood this eventually. Why do you think he really sealed the quarry entrance? The question hit like a physical blow. Laurent died trying to stop you. Laurent died because he tried to have it both ways. He sealed the chamber to protect other workers, but he'd already accepted transformation himself. The cave-in wasn't an accident. It was his body rejecting the integration process because his mind remained divided. Marguerite walked to the chamber's far wall, where symbols covered the stone in intricate patterns. As she moved, her reflection appeared in the copper vessels, but the reflections showed different versions of her, older, younger, wearing different clothes, different faces entirely. Each generation of your family has come closer to understanding the choice. Your grandfather Raymond documented everything but refused participation. Your father buried the knowledge but couldn't escape the calling. You're the first to come down here willingly, repeatedly, seeking understanding rather than avoidance. Maybe because I'm the first to be stupid enough, or the first to be ready. She touched one of the wall symbols, and the entire chamber filled with soft light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. In that illumination, I could see details I'd missed before. Passages leading to spaces I hadn't explored. Machinery built into the walls themselves. Equipment that combined human engineering with something far older. The brewery is perfect for our purposes, Marguerite said. Fermentation is already a transformation process, organic matter changing form, developing new properties, becoming something greater than its components. We simply apply the same principles to more complex organisms. And if I refuse, then you return to your old life, follow Tommy's rules, maintain the boundaries until you tire of the responsibility. Eventually, someone else will make the choice you're avoiding. The humming from the vessels grew louder, more complex, like a conversation conducted in frequencies beyond human hearing. But as I listened, I began to distinguish individual voices within the harmonics. People speaking in languages I didn't recognize, sharing knowledge I couldn't understand. What would integration involve? Gradual transition over several months. You'd continue your work at the brewery, but with enhanced perception and capabilities. The ability to see the network clearly, to communicate with entities across multiple sites, to understand the true history of this region. She turned away from the wall, and in the strange light, her appearance shifted. For a moment, I glimpsed other faces layered beneath her features, men and women from different eras, all wearing expressions of contentment and purpose. The rendering workers, the quarry crew, night shift employees from breweries and facilities across Vermont. All of them found peace through integration. Their knowledge lives on, their experiences enriched by connection to something larger than individual existence. And their humanity? Preserved in new form, enhanced rather than diminished. I thought about Laurent's journal, about Tommy's shaky handwriting, about 4 generations of Bouchard men, who'd encountered this choice and found different ways to avoid it. Each solution had been temporary, requiring the next generation to face the same decision with even fewer options. How long do I have to decide? Integration works best when chosen freely, without coercion or time pressure. But circumstances are changing. Development pressure is increasing throughout the region. The limestone caves are being mapped by geological surveys. The old sites are becoming harder to maintain without attracting attention. The light in the chamber began to fade, returning us to the familiar dimness of my flashlight beam. But something had changed in my perception. I could see farther into the darkness, distinguish details that should have been beyond the reach of artificial illumination. "You're already beginning to change," Marguerite observed. "Extended exposure to the network has effects. Your great-grandfather experienced the same enhancement during his final weeks. The question is whether you'll embrace the process or fight it like he did." I touched the wall where she'd activated the symbols and felt warmth spreading through the stone. The symbols seemed to respond to my presence, glowing faintly, as if recognizing something familiar in my touch. "The Bouchard family has been connected to this network for 4 generations," she said. "Your blood carries markers that make integration easier, more stable. That's why we've been patient with your lineage, why we've waited for someone ready to accept partnership instead of merely maintaining boundaries." Above us, I heard the distant sound of the brewery's equipment cycling through its automated processes. Fermentation tanks bubbling, cooling systems maintaining temperature, pumps circulating glycol through closed loops. All of it representing transformation. Raw materials becoming something refined, basic elements combining into complex compounds. If I agree to integration, what happens to the brewery? It becomes what it was always meant to be. A facility where transformation occurs openly, efficiently, permanently. The tourists will continue their tastings, the day staff will manage production, but the real work will happen during night shifts. And Dale? Beth? The other employees? Will continue their lives unchanged unless they choose otherwise. Integration isn't forced. It's offered to those ready to accept enhancement. The humming from the vessels softened to a whisper, but the voices within remained audible. They sounded welcoming now, like a conversation I was being invited to join rather than overhear. Marguerite moved toward the passage that led back to the brewery. "Consider what you've learned tonight. Feel the changes already beginning in your perception and understanding. The choice will become clearer as the transformation progresses. And if I choose to stop the process, the same thing that happened to Laurent. Integration attempted but not completed. Physical form rejecting enhancement, while consciousness remains divided. It's not a pleasant way to exist." She paused at the passage entrance. "But you won't choose that path. The Bouchard curiosity that brought you here won't allow you to walk away from the most significant discovery your family has ever made." I watched her disappear into the tunnel, her white dress fading into darkness that no longer seemed complete. My enhanced vision followed her progress through passages I hadn't explored, tracking her movement through spaces that connected to sites across Vermont. When I returned to the brewery's main floor, the building felt smaller than before. The equipment seemed crude compared to the integrated systems I'd glimpsed in the underground chamber. The fermentation tanks looked like toys beside the copper vessels that contained centuries of accumulated knowledge. I completed my shift mechanically, recording temperatures and cleaning equipment, while my mind processed everything Marguerite had revealed. By dawn, I understood that the choice had already been made weeks ago when I'd first opened Tommy's notebook and decided to follow rules I didn't understand. The only question now was whether I'd accept the transformation consciously or let it progress until fighting became pointless. The breaking point came on December 3rd, during the first blizzard of winter. I'd been experiencing changes for 3 weeks. Enhanced night vision, the ability to hear conversations through solid walls, and increasing sensitivity to the limestone cave network that ran beneath half of Chittenden County. My apartment in Winooski felt cramped and artificial compared to the vast spaces underground. Food tasted flat. Sleep brought dreams of copper vessels and voices speaking in harmonized frequencies. Most disturbing was how normal it all seemed. The transformation wasn't forcing itself on me. It was revealing capabilities I'd apparently always possessed but never accessed, like finding muscles you'd never used, or discovering rooms in a house you'd lived in for years. That night, the snow was falling hard enough to cancel most evening activities in Burlington. The brewery's tasting room had closed early, and Dale sent the day crew home before the roads became treacherous. By 11 p.m., I was alone in the building, with only the storm for company. The power went out at 11:47 p.m. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the production floor in red shadows that made the equipment look organic, alive. The fermentation tanks continued their work. The yeast didn't need electricity to convert sugars into alcohol, but the cooling system shut down, and the temperature began to rise. I was checking the backup generator when I heard vehicles in the parking lot. Through the storm, I saw 3 sets of headlights approaching the brewery. Not the typical cars that employees drove, but heavy trucks with snow tires and light bars that cut through the blizzard like searchlights. They parked in formation, engines running, and several figures emerged wearing winter gear that looked more tactical than casual. My enhanced hearing picked up radio chatter even through the storm noise. Federal agents talking about containment protocols and site security. They knew about the network. I killed the emergency lighting and moved to the basement, where the red exit signs provided enough illumination for my improved vision. The federal presence meant someone had connected Laurent's research to current activities. Probably geological surveys detecting the cave network, or satellite imaging showing heat signatures from underground chambers. The 1847 door stood open. Marguerite waited in the passage beyond, no longer wearing her white dress. Instead, she was clothed in what looked like tactical gear, similar to the agents outside. Black material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "They've been monitoring the site for 6 months," she said without preamble. "Electromagnetic readings, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging. Our enhanced activities have attracted attention." Enhanced activities? The integration process generates energy signatures that register on modern equipment. As you've developed capabilities, the chamber system has become more active, more visible to those who know what to look for. Above us, I heard boots on the production floor. Heavy, measured steps that suggested military or law enforcement training. Multiple individuals spreading out to search the building systematically. What do they want? Containment, study, weaponization, eventually. The federal government has been aware of networks like ours since the 1940s. Most sites are monitored but left undisturbed as long as they remain stable. But transformation events trigger intervention protocols. She led me deeper into the tunnel system, past chambers I hadn't explored. Here, the walls were covered with symbols that glowed without external light source, providing navigation markers for enhanced vision. The skinwalkers made contact with government researchers in 1952, Marguerite continued. Shared information about the underground networks in exchange for protection from encroachment. That's how the federal agencies learned to identify active sites. You're saying the government knows about all this? Knows, monitors, occasionally intervenes, but they prefer stable arrangements to disruption. A caretaker following established rules represents manageable risk. Transformation events represent potential expansion beyond acceptable parameters. We reached a chamber I'd never seen, larger than the brewery's basement, with passages leading in 8 directions. The space felt ancient, carved from bedrock by tools that predated European settlement. But it also contained modern equipment, computers, communications gear, monitoring devices that hummed with electronic activity. "This is the Regional Coordination Center," Marguerite explained. "We maintain contact with entities across multiple states from here. The federal agencies know about it, but as long as we self-regulate, they leave us alone." Self-regulate how? Limiting integration events to volunteers, maintaining boundaries with surface populations, avoiding activities that generate excessive electromagnetic signatures or attract public attention. She approached one of the computer terminals and activated a display showing a map of Vermont with dozens of blinking points. Some were green, some yellow, a few red. Green sites are stable, caretakers following established protocols. Yellow sites show elevated activity, but remain within acceptable parameters. Red sites require intervention. The brewery showed as red. "Your transformation process has accelerated beyond normal timelines," she said. "The Bouchard genetic markers make integration more efficient, but also more visible to monitoring equipment. The federal team upstairs has orders to contain the situation." "Contain how?" "Depends on what they find. If they locate only maintenance tunnels and normal basement storage, they'll file a report about false readings and leave. If they discover the chamber system, they'll implement Protocol 7, which is permanent containment. The site gets sealed with thermite charges, all personnel get transferred to research facilities, and the official record shows equipment malfunction causing structural collapse." Above us, the footsteps had multiplied. I heard voices discussing anomalous readings in the basement area and preparing shaped charges for emergency demolition. "They're going to destroy the brewery. Only if they find evidence of network activity. But your presence here, combined with the enhanced electromagnetic signatures, makes discovery likely." Marguerite moved to another terminal and began entering commands. Displays showed camera feeds from throughout the brewery. Agents setting up equipment, examining the electrical room where I'd found the first tunnel entrance, preparing explosive devices for rapid site demolition. "There's another option," she said. "Complete the integration process now, tonight. Fully transformed entities don't register on federal monitoring equipment. You'd become invisible to their sensors while retaining all human knowledge and memory." "What about my life above ground?" "Maintained as necessary. You'd continue working at the brewery, living in your apartment, interacting with family and friends. But your enhanced capabilities would allow you to manage the network more effectively while avoiding federal attention." On the display screens, I watched agents descending toward the basement. They moved with practiced efficiency, using equipment that detected energy signatures I was apparently generating just by being present in the chamber system. "How long do I have?" "Minutes. The integration chambers are prepared, but transformation requires conscious acceptance. It can't be forced or rushed without risking the same rejection Laurent experienced." I thought about my great-grandfather's journal, about the choice that had killed him because he couldn't commit fully, about Tommy's rules and the 2 years he'd spent maintaining boundaries that were never meant to be permanent, about 4 generations of Bouchard men who'd encountered this decision and found ways to delay rather than resolve it. If I refuse, the agents will find the network, implement containment protocols, and destroy everything we've built here. The entities will survive. We always do. But this site will be lost, and the federal agencies will increase monitoring across the region. And if I accept, integration completes in approximately 30 minutes. The electromagnetic signatures disappear. The agents find only normal basement storage and file reports about equipment malfunction. The brewery continues operating, but with enhanced management capabilities that prevent future federal interest. The footsteps above had reached the basement stairs. Through the building's structure, I heard radio communications coordinating search patterns and demolition preparations. Marguerite approached the central copper vessel, which began to glow as she drew near. The choice your family has been avoiding for 4 generations: evolution or extinction, partnership or destruction. I looked at the monitoring displays one more time. The agents were thorough, professional, and obviously experienced with sites like this. They'd find the tunnels within minutes, and once they confirmed the network's existence, Protocol 7 would proceed automatically. Everything Laurent had documented, everything my grandfather had preserved, everything my father had tried to hide, all of it would be destroyed by people who saw only threat rather than opportunity. The integration process, I said. What exactly does it involve? Immersion in the central vessel for approximately 20 minutes, while consciousness transfers to enhanced form. Your human body remains intact, but becomes capable of existing in environments and conditions that would destroy normal physiology. Memory, personality, knowledge, all preserved but enhanced with capabilities accumulated over centuries of network experience. The copper vessel's surface rippled like liquid metal, responding to our proximity. The humming sound returned, but now I could distinguish individual voices within the harmonics, previous volunteers sharing their experiences, their knowledge, their contentment with transformation. Will I still be Ethan Bouchard? You'll be Ethan Bouchard with capabilities Ethan Bouchard never imagined possessing. Enhanced perception, extended lifespan, connection to knowledge accumulated across multiple centuries. Everything that makes you human, but without the limitations that make humans vulnerable. The agents had reached the electrical room. Their equipment was detecting the tunnel entrance, generating readings that would trigger automatic containment protocols within minutes. I approached the vessel, feeling its warmth even through the copper surface. This was the choice Laurent had faced, the decision my grandfather had avoided, the responsibility my father had tried to bury, 4 generations of delay, ending now. I accept integration, I said. The vessel opened like a flower, revealing interior space that seemed larger than its external dimensions. The liquid inside glowed with soft light that felt welcoming rather than threatening. As I stepped forward, I heard the voices of everyone who'd made this choice before me, offering guidance and reassurance. Above us, the agents found the tunnel entrance. Below us, I found transformation. Dale found me cleaning the bottling equipment at 7 a.m., just like every other morning for the past 4 months. Power came back on around 3, he said, checking the overnight logs. Generator kicked in perfect when we lost grid connection. You handled the outage okay? No problems, I said, noting how my voice carried exactly the same inflection it always had. Temperature held steady in the fermentation tanks. Everything stayed stable. He nodded and poured coffee from the pot I'd prepared, something I'd been doing every morning since my first week. The routine felt comfortable, familiar, even though comfort and familiarity were concepts I now understood from a perspective no human had ever possessed. Federal inspection went smoothly yesterday, Dale continued. Environmental Protection Agency, checking on our wastewater systems, found everything up to code, filed clean reports. I smiled the same smile I'd always worn. That's good news. What Dale didn't know was that the EPA inspection had been cover for the federal team that arrived during the blizzard. They'd found exactly what Marguerite had promised: basement storage, normal electrical systems, and readings that indicated routine brewery operations. The agents had spent 6 hours searching before concluding their equipment had malfunctioned during the storm. Their report, filed that morning, recommended downgrading the brewery from active monitoring to routine surveillance. No further federal interest anticipated. Beth arrived at 8:30 with the day's production schedule and a box of pastries from Mirabelle's Cafe in Burlington. She distributed breakfast to the morning crew, chatting about weekend plans and the upcoming holidays. "Ethan, you look good," she said, offering me a maple scone. "Getting more sleep lately?" "Yeah, finally adjusted to the night schedule." This was true in ways she couldn't comprehend. I no longer required sleep in any human sense, though I maintained the appearance of normal rest patterns. Instead of sleeping, I spent daylight hours exploring the network, coordinating with entities across Vermont, and learning capabilities that enhanced my effectiveness as both brewery employee and site manager. The integration had preserved everything that made me Ethan Bouchard, while adding knowledge and abilities accumulated over centuries. I remembered childhood summers at Lake Champlain, my first job at the Burlington lumber yard, the taste of my grandmother's tourtière at Christmas dinner. But I also remembered the construction of the rendering facility in 1847, the first contact between skinwalkers and federal researchers, and the patient work of maintaining balance between worlds that most humans never suspected existed. My enhanced perception showed me details the day staff couldn't detect. Beth's slight headache from staying up too late grading her daughter's homework. Dale's concern about his father's recent heart surgery. The satisfaction of the brewing crew as they watched another successful fermentation reaching completion. But I also perceived the network's steady pulse beneath the building, the communication between sites across multiple states, and the contentment of entities who'd found partnership instead of conflict with surface populations. At noon, I drove home to my Winooski apartment for what appeared to be normal daytime rest. My neighbors saw me carrying groceries, checking mail, living the routine life of a night shift worker. But appearances served purposes beyond simple deception. The federal agencies monitored for disruption of normal patterns. Integration worked precisely because it preserved those patterns while enabling capabilities that operated below their detection thresholds. That evening, I returned to Caledonia Brewing for another shift. The building welcomed me like an old friend. Its familiar sounds and smells now layered with deeper harmonics only enhanced perception could appreciate. Tommy's notebook still sat in my locker, though I no longer needed its guidance. The 7 rules had served their purpose, maintaining boundaries until someone was ready to dissolve them constructively. Tonight, like every night since integration, I would monitor the brewery's operations, maintain the equipment, and ensure quality fermentation. But I would also coordinate network activities, communicate with entities across the region, and continue the work Laurent Bouchard had begun in those limestone quarries a century ago. The Bouchard family had always been diggers. Some excavations revealed stone, others revealed truth. Both required patience, skill, and the wisdom to know when to keep digging despite the risks.